So now that we've talked about how unions make decisions, let's end the chapter by turning our attention to the effect of unions. So understanding unions is critical for a few reasons. First, it has been public policy for almost 100 years in the US to allow workers to unionize, to collectively bargain for their wages and working conditions. Is this a wise policy, or does it end up having more costs than benefits? We need to regularly revisit policy to find out if it's having its intended result or if the costs are higher than the benefits that we get. Furthermore, we can ask, what is the question or what is the impact of public sector unions? This is also an important question. Now, there's considerable variation across states for private unions, but also for public sector unions. So determining the optimal policy will yield some benefit for us because we see these differences between states. Finally, how do unions impact industries and firms that are forced to compete in a global marketplace? So are unions leading to a decline in employment? Are they causing firms to lose to international competitors, or are these fears overblown? By getting the answer to some of these questions, it will obviously, if we can estimate whether it's working or not, figure it out, that will be highly beneficial for society. For those of us working in human resources, some of you may have to deal with unions and with union leaderships in your career. So understanding how unions make decisions is also very important. So if you ask a union member or any member of the public what the effects of unions are on wages, they're going to answer something like quite a bit. So in a survey that was done back in, I think, the 70s or the 80s, 2/3 of Americans believe that unions increased wages. 47% of respondents thought that without unions, workers in the US would have third world living standards, which is a little extreme, but it goes to show the positive influence that so many people believe that unions have. But we do need to ask ourselves some questions about how to measure. Do we want to determine how much unions increase wages compared to what those workers would make without unions? Or do we want to compare them to similar non-unionized workers? One of the main issues in labor economics that we've been dealing with for the past 2 years has been about proper identification strategy. In other words, this question right here, not just for unions, but for all types of labor market institutions or different laws and regulations that impact labor. So the problem is, if we try to determine the true wage gain, we would take the difference between the wage with unions and the wage without unions for those same workers divided by the wage without unions. That would be the percent wage gain from unionization. The issue here is that the wage without unions for those same workers are unobservable, by definition, because those workers are members of unions. This isn't Schrodinger's union. It can't exist for those workers and also not exist for those workers at the same time. So we have to figure out a way to try to estimate it rather than having the actual numbers. So often our tactic is to compare union wages to similar workers without a union, but this also presents some issues. Some of those are how good of a match are those non-union workers? To how similar can we really consider those industries? There are also issues of spillover effects. So unionization at one firm or one industry impacts non-unionized workers at other firms or other industries. So maybe firms pay higher wages to try to prevent unions from forming. Maybe unions are strong enough to increase equilibrium wages throughout the entire industry, if it's heavily unionized. Your textbook dives into the methods of how we estimate union wage gaps. I'm going to skip a lot of that. You guys don't need to know that for this class. Again, because this is human resources, we want to be a lot more practical than just looking at studies that try to estimate stuff. So I'll summarize basically what we know about the union wage gap. So we spilled a lot of ink trying to estimate the impact of unions. Some of them look at specific unions, others look at all unions in the country. There's still more that look at unions across the world. Combined, labor economists consistently find that unions increase wages relative to not having unions. How much they increase does vary between studies, between the period of time we're looking at, between countries, and between industries. Now, our model of bargaining power explains some of this reality. Some unions may have very strong bargaining power, and are able to get major concessions from management, while others have little and are forced to largely agree with management's terms. Now, the wage gaps or the wage gains from unionization are going to vary based on economic conditions. In normal times, the pay gap is between 10 and 20% in the United States, which is a pretty considerable wage gain. However, in inflationary environments, like we have today, the gaps are going to be much lower. One of the reasons is because unions often negotiate their contracts years in advance, so they can lock themselves into lower pay raises that doesn't meet inflation. Remember how I said early in an earlier lecture that unions could increase their wages more times inflation through collective bargaining? Well, in many cases, in order to do that, they'd have to threaten a strike or try to use their bargaining power to renegotiate in the meantime, which isn't always possible. So if they have a lot of bargaining power, they may be able to keep up with the increases in inflation in the short run. If they don't have a lot of bargaining power, they're not going to be able to in the short run. Over the long run, they will be able to negotiate to bring up their wages in line with inflation, but in the short run, they won't. Now, what about public sector unions? Public sector unions tend to result in lower wage premiums for their members than we see from private sector unions. It's going to typically be under 10%. However, it is important to remember that government workers don't earn high salaries. They get job security and an easy work environment. So the wage premium doesn't quite capture this. We need to look at other non-pecuniary benefits or non-wage benefits to really see what the effects of government unions are. That's not to say the labor unions don't improve working conditions. That was, along with wages, one of their major drivers for early unionization was making sure that workers had decent working conditions, that they were safe and all that. But private sector unions also tend to have higher wage increases than we see in public sector unions.